Hello and welcome back to the third installment of this video series. In this video, we are going to be covering The Prisoner of Azkaban. Now, while reading this book, I noticed there wasn't much to talk about thematically speaking. In particular, there are very little subversive or negative themes covered in this book. The major subversion comes from the movie, which sought to remove most of the light-hearted scenes and make the atmosphere surrounding the third part of the story to be much darker than it should have been. Therefore, in this video, I'll be covering some of the better themes within Harry Potter and comparing scenes from the book with that of the movies. So without further ado, let's begin. These movies were made for the majority of people to be able to like and understand, which is why they are so bad. They try to appeal not to midwits, but to dimwits, who would point at the screen whenever something happened with a mouth agape and be in constant awe of the film. This sort of cheap and low standard of writing is seen in most Marvel films as well, where, when characters do something from the comics, or say some stupid catchphrase, it provokes the same reaction from the normies. In doing so, the Harry Potter movies begin to strip away the heart and soul of the books. They begin to subvert characters and abandon themes altogether. You no longer have a very profound underlying message like in the books. Instead, you get a secular take of the message, essentially dumbing it down so that it is no longer something impressive and interesting to look at. Unless you're one of these people. The very first scene of the movie is an inaccuracy, showing Harry to be using magic outside of Hogwarts, and this should set the precedent for how things are going to be in this movie. Next, there's Harry's anger in the scenes with Marge.
Doubt? That's a lie.
What did you say?
My dad wasn't a drunk. Shut up! Shut up!
Harry does get angry in the books, but not exceedingly so. And it's also a thing to note that Marge was staying for a week at the Dursleys, and it was only on the last day that Harry finally got angry. He storms from the house and spots Sirius in dog form, who then barks viciously at Harry. This doesn't make sense as we learn in the ending that Sirius is actually the good guy who was framed. The scenes on the night bus are very corny and awful as well. Stan's conversation with Harry was rather different.
Who is that? That man?
Who is that? Who is... That is Sirius Black, that is. Don't tell me you've never been hearing of Sirius Black. He's a murderer. Got himself locked up in Azkaban for it.
How did he escape?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? He's the first one that done it. He was a big supporter of... You know who. Reckon you've heard of him?
Yeah. Him I've heard of.
That man, Harry said, forgetting his troubles for a moment. He was on the Muggle news. Stanley turned to the front page and chuckled. Sirius Black, he said, nodding. Of course he was on the Muggle news level. Where you been? He gave a superior sort of chuckle at the blank look on Harry's face, removed the front page and handed it to Harry. You ought to read the papers more, Neville. Harry held the paper up to the candlelight and read. Scary looking thing, innit? Said Stan, who had been watching Harry read. He murdered 13 people, said Harry, handing the page back to Stan, with one curse. Yep, in front of witnesses and all. Broad daylight. Big trouble it caused, didn't it? Suffice to say, the conversation in the book is more normal and natural. The movies will continue to exaggerate different characters and conversations, which lead the movie to seem very artificial, and one sees actors on a stage rather than characters in a fantasy world. They also introduce a bit of cheap comedy with the night bus, where they stop for an old lady, squeezing between two buses, and Harry falling flat against the glass repeatedly. This is very cheap and weak comedy. It's meant to appeal to the lowest common denominator, which is why they went for this rather than any sort of meaningful comedy. Comedic relief in the books usually came in the form of the Weasleys. Both Fred and George and Ron are quite funny in the book, but all of that is lost in the movies. When Harry arrives at the Leaky Cauldron, he is greeted by this man. He is supposed to be Tom the barkeeper and landlord to the Leaky Cauldron, but he is nowhere near how the characters portrayed in the books. Moving on, Harry is allowed to stay in the Leaky Cauldron and Diagon Alley for the last few weeks of the holidays. and there's a stark contrast between life at the Dursleys and life in the Wizarding world. It took Harry several days to get used to his strange new freedom. Never before had he been able to get up whenever he wanted or eat whatever he fancied. He could even go wherever he liked, as long as it was in Diagon Alley, and as this long cobbled street was packed with the most fascinating wizard shops in the world, Harry felt no desire to break his word to Fudge and stray back into the Muggle world. Harry ate breakfast each morning in the Leaky Cauldron, where he liked watching the other guests. Funny little witches from the country up for a day's shopping, venerable-looking wizards arguing over the latest article in Transfiguration today, wild-looking warlocks, raucous dwarfs, and once, what looked suspiciously like a hag, who ordered a plate of raw liver from behind a thick woolen balaclava. After breakfast, Harry would go out into the backyard, take out his wand, tap the third brick from the left above the dustbin, and stand back, as the archway into Diagon Alley opened in the wall. Harry spent the long sunny days exploring the shops and eating under the brightly coloured umbrellas outside cafes, where his fellow diners were showing each other their purchases. Harry didn't have to do his homework under the blankets by torchlight anymore. Now, he could sit in the bright sunshine outside Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlour, finishing all his essays with occasional help from Florian Fortescue himself, who, apart from knowing a great deal about medieval witch burnings, gave Harry free Sundays every half hour. A parallel that one could draw here is that people tend to be happier in homogeneous areas of their own ethnic group. This is the first wonderful theme of the book, and it is something that was also mentioned in the first two novels as well. Harry feels much more at home in the Wizarding world than in the Muggle world. He is much more comfortable being around his own people, which are wizards, than being around those that were different to him, Muggles. And that doesn't only mean the Dursleys. Much of the neighbours were also quite nosy and boring, and Mrs. Figg, Harry's babysitter, was an awfully dull person in Harry's opinion. Harry was always happier to be in the Wizarding world and be surrounded by wizards and witches like him. We saw it when he first entered Diagon Alley in the first book, when he was at the Burrow in the second, and now here, as he is allowed to stay in the Leaky Cauldron. But this sort of community and belonging was not shown in the movies, and will continue not to be shown in the movies. In the next novel, there are many scenes of wizards and witches being a close-formed community while camping for the Quidditch World Cup, but none of this is shown in the movie either. Moving on, throughout this novel, Harry comes face to face with creatures known as Dementors. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the shivering flames in Lupin's hand, was a cloaked figure that towered to the ceiling. Its face was completely hidden beneath its hood. Harry's eyes darted downwards, and what he saw made his stomach contract. There was a hand protruding from the cloak, and it was glistening, greyish, slimy looking, and scabbed, like something dead that had decayed in water. It was visible only for a split second. As though the creature beneath the cloak sensed Harry's gaze, the hand was suddenly withdrawn into the folds of the black material. And then the thing beneath the hood, whatever it was, drew a long, slow, rattling breath, as though it was trying to suck something more than air from its surroundings. An intense cold swept over them all. Harry felt his own breath catch in his chest. The cold went deeper than his skin. It was inside his chest. It was inside his very heart. Harry's eyes rolled up into his head. He couldn't see. He was drowning in cold. There was a rushing in his ears, as though of water. He was being dragged downwards, the roaring growing louder. And then, from far away, he heard screaming. Terrible, terrified, pleading screams. He wanted to help whoever it was. He tried to move his arms, but couldn't. A thick white fog was swirling around him, inside him. The Dementors force Harry to relive his worst memories, and that is of his parents being murdered. Even though he was just a baby at the time, these memories come to the forefront whenever the Dementors are near, and so they affect him more than anyone else. Naturally, this is a very difficult thing for Harry to overcome. Later, when he is trying to learn the Patronus charm, one of the reasons he failed in the beginning was not because of a lack of happy memories, but he wanted to hear his parents' voice again. Here in the series, Harry finally comes to accept that his parents are gone, and they aren't coming back. He reminisced about them in the first book, Through the Mirror of Erised, where Dumbledore gave him similar advice, that it did not do well to dwell on the past and forget to live. And who helps Harry along the way but Remus Lupin? Lupin's bond with Harry is something that was lost in the films. In the books, they were like uncle and nephew. Lupin wanted to protect Harry, to help him, and Lupin understood Harry better than most, even better than Sirius. But through the movies, that bond was lost. Lupin's interactions with Harry seem rather flat, and there are no heart-to-heart conversations about Harry's dad. This scene in the movie with Harry and Lupin on the bridge never took place in the book, and it seemed very forced, with somber music in the background to brainwash the audience into thinking this is a happy and deep scene when it is very lackluster. And this trend continues in later movies, where Lupin doesn't seem connected to Harry at all. There are very few scenes between them, and many scenes with Harry and Lupin were omitted from the movies, such as Harry talking to Lupin and Sirius about his dad after seeing Snape's memory in the pensieve, or Harry arguing with Lupin about Lupin's responsibilities as a father and husband. Lupin was like family to Harry. He was as much family to him as Sirius was. He was someone that he could count on and rely upon after Sirius's death. The fat lady in this movie was another awful portrayal of character. Again, they tried to introduce this cheap form of comedy, with scenes such as this one.
No, wait! What's this? Amazing! Just with my voice! Amazing.
Fortuna Major.
Yes, all right. Go.
And the scene where her portrait was attacked was heavily dramatized as well, mostly because of the terrible acting of Michael Gambon as Dumbledore. But before I rant about Michael Gambon and many other subversions of characters in the movie, let me address two topics that come up in the novel and movie. The first is animal cruelty. This is tied to the running story of the fate of a creature known as Buckbeak. Buckbeak was a hippogriff that Hagrid introduced in their first Care of Magical Creatures lesson. Malfoy, who wasn't paying attention to what Hagrid was saying, angers the creature, which then attacks him, leaving a deep gash in Malfoy's arm. Having been injured by the creature, his father was now adamant on its execution, insisting that it was dangerous. Lucius uses his influence in the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures to ensure that regardless of how hard Hagrid fought the case, the decision was already preordained. There are two things to note here. The first is power and influence in the hands of the bad man, in the hands of the man who advocates for pure-bloodedness, and also a general display of cruelty to animals, which is mirrored in his son Draco. Again, this does not match up with reality. If we look at the majority of large corporations and powerful men, they all subscribe to left-wing politics, and right-wing figures are largely deplatformed, censored, or even suppressed. Furthermore, the Nazi Party were the exact opposite of cruel to animals. In fact, they advocated for the welfare and proper treatment of animals. The following comes from an article written on animal protection laws by the Nazi Party, and this article is written by Bret Stephens. For example, in Nazi Germany, people who mistreated their pets could be sentenced to 2 years in jail. The Nazis banned the production of foie gras and docking the ears and tails of dogs without anesthesia, and they severely restricted invasive animal research. The Nazi Party established the first laws ensuring that animals used in films were not mistreated, and also mandated humane slaughter procedures for food animals, and for the euthanasia of terminally ill pets. In addition, the German government established nature preserves, a school curriculum for the humane treatment of animals, and they hosted one of the first international conferences on animal protection. While concern for animal suffering was not universal among the Nazi hierarchy, Arluc and Sachs convincingly argued that pro-animal sentiment was widespread. In 1933, Hermann Goering announced he would commit to concentration camps those who still think they can treat animals as property. The feared Heinrich Himmler once asked his doctor, who was a hunter, "How can you find pleasure, Herr Kirstein, in shooting from behind at poor creatures browsing on the edge of a wood? It is really murder." So yes, where Lucius Malfoy might be a very cruel man in the books and movies, he is in no way reflective of the right or the Nazis in real life. If you'd like to read more on this topic, see the links in the description below. Then there are the many faces of the truth, exampled in the events surrounding Sirius Black's story. The public have their own perception, as we saw through Stan Shunpike, who thought that Sirius was Voldemort's right-hand man, who wanted to rule after Voldemort's demise, and so he murdered those people as he was cornered by the Ministry and didn't want to come quietly. The teachers of Hogwarts and the Minister of Magic have a more informed view. They knew that the murders of those 13 people were related to the death of Harry's parents. What they got wrong, however, was that they thought Sirius had betrayed Harry's parents, and when confronted by Peter Pettigrew, Sirius murdered him and 12 people. The truth, however, was that Peter betrayed the Potters, and it was Sirius who confronted him and not the other way around. Peter blew apart the street, killing 12 people. Peter then cut off his own finger and transformed into a rat to fake his death. I think this is a good parallel of news in today's society, where the mainstream media would almost never show the actual truth of a matter. But it is even more sinister in real life than in the book, because the media warp and twist the truth purposefully, whereas in Harry Potter it is a more genuine misconception of the surrounding events. But we'll speak more about propaganda, the government, and the media in video 5, when it becomes a major theme. Returning to the characters' portrayal in the movies now, there were several subversions in the movie to make characters seem rather different. Ron is portrayed as a wimp and a dimwit throughout. Harry is portrayed as extremely emotional. Hermione is once again portrayed as much better than she is in the books. Sirius and Lupin aren't shown to be the sort of fatherly figures as they were to Harry. In fact, Sirius was actually portrayed as a much more deranged lunatic in the movies. Draco is also portrayed as wimpy, and not at all like the swaggered boy in the books. Hagrid's character is a bit off, and Dumbledore is just awful. Ron's wimpy demeanour is an extension of his character in the second film, where it was shown that he was a crybaby when faced with the spiders. That is shown again in this movie, where they include this scene that wasn't present in the book.
Spiders, they want me to tap dance. I don't want to tap dance.
You tell those spiders, Ron.
Oh, yeah, I'll tell.
There's also him screaming as Sirius dragged him away, when in the book he was not screaming but trying to fight against Sirius and get the dog off him. Ron is brave and is Harry's best friend. As I've said, their relationship is akin to that of Sam and Frodo from Lord of the Rings. But in these movies, one really doesn't get that impression of Ron at all. In fact, he seems like the wimpy sidekick to an emotionally unstable teenager. Which plays into my second point, of making Harry seem overly emotional in the film. We've already covered how irrationally angry he gets, and again, even though Harry is angry in the book, he never has lines like these.
He was their friend! I hope he finds me. Because when he does, I'm gonna be ready. When he does, I'm gonna kill him. Then it'll be you!
But he was also shown to be crying in the film, after learning that Sirius betrayed his parents, which Harry never did. The only time he shed a tear in this book was when he heard how his dad faced Voldemort to give him and his mom a chance to escape, and was killed for it. And even then, he hid this from Lupin. One of the things I was always impressed by in the novels is how J.K. Rowling wrote the boys. Harry does a lot of things young males can relate to. He breaks the rules, does homework at the last minute, shares answers with Ron, seeks thrill and adventure, takes risks, he was interested in and played sports, and in later novels he even chases after girls. And where emotions are concerned, he deals with them more through his actions than words or outright displays of anger or sadness like movie Harry. Book Harry internalized what he heard about Sirius, and his natural conclusion was that he hated Sirius for betraying his parents. And though he didn't feel so strongly he wanted to kill Sirius, he knew he wanted to do something. And then there's Hermione. In adapting this book to film, they removed some brainy scenes from the book and gave her some more action scenes in the movie. Her punch to Malfoy is a good place to start.
You foul, loathsome, evil little cockroach!
Hermione, no! He's not worth it. Malfoy, you okay? You're
Let's go! Come, quick! Let's go, run!
Hagrid turned around and hurried back towards his cabin, his face buried in his handkerchief. Look at him blubber. Malfoy, Grab and Goyle had been standing just inside the castle doors listening. Have you ever seen anything quite as pathetic? Said Malfoy. And he's supposed to be your teacher. Harry and Ron both made furious moves towards Malfoy, but Hermione got there first. She had slapped Malfoy around the face with all the strength she could muster. Malfoy staggered. Harry, Ron, Grab and Goyle stood flabbergasted as Hermione raised her hand again. Don't you dare call Hagrid pathetic, you foul, you evil... Hermione, said Ron weakly, and he tried to grab her hand as she swung it back. Get off, Ron! Hermione pulled out her wand. Malfoy stepped backwards. Grab and Goyle looked at him for instructions, thoroughly bewildered. Come on, Malfoy muttered, and next moment all three of them had disappeared into the passageway to the dungeons. She slapped Malfoy, not punched him. And Malfoy wasn't whimpering like some pathetic beta male that was terrified of Hermione. There was something humbling about that slap, as it shut him up, but at the same time he was feeling ashamed that he allowed Hermione to slap him in front of his cronies. So, he just shrugs it off and walks away, trying to keep his dignity. But in the movie, he is seen running from her like a big crybaby. Hermione also has to tell Hagrid what to do when Malfoy was injured.
Hagrid! He has to be taken to the hospital.
Whereas in the book, Hagrid simply did what he had to do without prompt from Hermione. She also figures out what Dumbledore had meant.
Look, Buckbeak's still alive.
Of course. Remember what Dumbledore said? If we succeed, more than one innocent life could be spared.
Whereas it was Harry who figured this out in the book and explains it to Hermione. Then there's a scene with the Whomping Willow, where Hermione dodges a hit from the Whomping Willow, but Harry, the seeker of the Gryffindor Quidditch team, with incredible reaction timing and athleticism, gets knocked flat on the grass. Hermione then lifts Harry into the air and throws him into the passageway. In the book, Crookshanks the cat helped them to get past the willow by pressing a knot on the tree's trunk that caused it to be immobilized. Then, inside the Shrieking Shack, Hermione stands in front of Harry and tells Sirius that if he was going to kill Harry, he would have to kill her and Ron as well, whereas in the book, Hermione was positively terrified, and Ron delivers this line instead to Sirius. I thought you'd come and help your friend, he said hoarsely. His voice sounded as though he had long ago lost the habit of using it. Your father would have done the same for me. Brave of you not to run for a teacher. I'm grateful. It will make everything much easier. Without knowing what he was doing, he started forwards, but there was a sudden movement on either side of him, and two pairs of hands grabbed him and held him back. No, Harry, Hermione gasped in a petrified whisper. Ron, however, spoke to Black. If you want to kill Harry, you'll have to kill us too, he said fiercely, though the effort of standing up had drained him of still more colour, and he swayed slightly as he spoke. Something flickered in Black's shadowed eyes. Lie down, he said quietly to Ron. You will damage that leg even more. Did you hear me? Ron said weakly, though he was clinging painfully to Harry to stay upright. You'll have to kill all three of us. Then there's Sirius himself, who seems very deranged in the movies.
Only one would die tonight.
Understand?
Let's kill him.
Wait!
I did my waiting! 12 years of it! In Azkaban!
Pettigrew. And he's in this room right now.
Come on, Peter! Come out and play!
Whereas in the book, it was mentioned that his sanity is what had kept him alive in Azkaban and allowed him to escape. The one redeeming scene for Sirius in this movie was where he and Harry were talking once outside the Shrieking Shack. The events of the book eventually lead us back inside the castle with Dumbledore. So let's speak about Dumbledore. Now, just by looking at the two actors, anyone can tell who seems like the better and more trustworthy person. If you showed anyone these two images and asked them who seemed like the more kind, trustworthy, sincere, and loving Dumbledore, I'm sure most would choose the one on the right, regardless of if they've seen the movies or not. And this is something that can't be ignored when looking at a character. Richard Harris took the role because his granddaughter refused to speak to him if he turned down the role of Dumbledore, so he said that had settled the matter. Meanwhile, Michael Gambon took up the role without having read any of the books and having no passion for the project really, and it's reflected in his portrayal of the character.
I first want to ask you about even just getting ready and getting into the mindset of this character, from putting on the makeup and the beard and everything.
Yeah.
Is that the process for you to just kind of envelop the character?
Well, I mean, I turn everyone into myself, so I don't get into character at all. I mean, every part I play, it's just a variation of me. It's me wearing a stuck-on beard and a long robe, so there's not a question of much getting into character.
And then there's his demeanor as well. Throughout the movie, he exaggerates this sort of mysterious side of Dumbledore. But honestly, it comes across as a man under the effects of hallucinogens, or some other drug that addles the mind.
For in dreams, we enter a world that's entirely our own. Let them swim in the deepest ocean, or glide over the highest cloud. Mysterious thing, time. Powerful, and when meddled with, dangerous. Sirius Black is in the topmost cell of the Dark Tower. You know the laws, Miss Granger.
These aren't the sort of things that Dumbledore would say in the books. He doesn't give these superficially shallow comments that are meant to be deep. And we obviously know of his most infamous interaction with Harry in the next movie.
Harry, did you put your name in a goblet of fire?
No, sir.
You asked one of the older students to do it for you?
No, sir.
And by and large, his character is nowhere near consistent with the Dumbledore in the book, who, it is very easy to picture, closer to Richard Harris when reading the novels. Because of this, some great interactions with him and Harry are lost completely in the movie. In the first two, we get very touching scenes, very wonderful scenes between Harry and Dumbledore, but in the third movie, perhaps one of the most touching scenes had been removed. And this continues all the way through to the seventh and final book, because this Dumbledore will not give us any of those heartwarming and lovely scenes.
Harry! I protest! Harry, did you put your name in a goblet of fire?
No, sir.
You asked one of the older students to do it for you?
No, sir.
Are you Alistair Moody? Are you?
No, sir.
Is he in this room?
No, sir.
Do you know who I am?
No, sir.
Ralph,
Sir.
Before I wrap up, let's look at the final conversations between Harry, Lupin, and Dumbledore in this novel. First, the scene where Harry drives away the Dementors. And out of the end of his wand burst, not a shapeless cloud of mist, but a blinding, dazzling silver animal. He screwed up his eyes, trying to see what it was. It looked like a horse. It was galloping silently away from him, across the black surface of the lake. He saw it lower its head and charge at the swarming Dementors. Now it was galloping around and around the black shapes on the ground, and the Dementors were falling back, scattering, retreating into the darkness. They were gone. The Patronus turned. It was cantering back towards Harry across the still surface of the water. It wasn't a horse. It wasn't a unicorn either. It was a stag. It was shining brightly as the moon above. It was coming back to him. It stopped on the bank. Its hooves made no mark on the soft ground as it stared at Harry with its large silver eyes. Slowly, it bowed its antlered head, and Harry realized. "Prongs," he whispered. But as his trembling fingertips stretched towards the creature, it vanished. And then later, when he was speaking to Dumbledore, "But I stopped Sirius and Professor Lupin killing Pettigrew. That makes it my fault if Voldemort comes back." "It does not," said Dumbledore quietly. "Hasn't your experience with the Time Turner taught you anything, Harry? The consequences of our actions are always so complicated, so diverse, that predicting the future is a very difficult business indeed. Professor Trelawney, bless her, is living proof of that. You did a very noble thing in saving Pettigrew's life. But if he helps Voldemort back to power, Pettigrew owes his life to you. You have sent Voldemort a deputy who is in your debt. When one wizard saves another wizard's life, it creates a certain bond between them, and I'm much mistaken if Voldemort wants his servant in the debt of Harry Potter. I don't want a bond with Pettigrew. He betrayed my parents. This is magic at its deepest, its most impenetrable, Harry. But trust me, The time may come when you will be very glad you saved Pettigrew's life. Harry couldn't imagine when that would be. Dumbledore looked as though he knew what Harry was thinking. I knew your father very well, both at Hogwarts and later, Harry, he said gently. He would have saved Pettigrew too. I am sure of it. Harry looked up at him. Dumbledore wouldn't laugh. He could tell Dumbledore. Last night, I thought it was my dad who conjured my Patronus. I mean, when I saw myself across the lake, I thought I was seeing him. An easy mistake to make, said Dumbledore softly. I expect you're tired of hearing it, but you do look extraordinarily like James. Except for your eyes. You have your mother's eyes. Harry shook his head. It was stupid, thinking it was him, he muttered. I mean, I knew he was dead. You think the dead we have loved ever truly leave us? You think that we don't recall them more clearly than ever in times of great trouble? Your father is alive in you, Harry, and shows himself most plainly when you have need of him. How else could you produce that particular Patronus? Prongs rode again last night. It took a moment for Harry to realize what Dumbledore had said. Sirius told me all about how they became animagi last night, said Dumbledore, smiling. An extraordinary achievement, not least keeping it quiet from me. And then I remembered the most unusual form your Patronus took when it charged Mr. Malfoy down at your Quidditch match against Ravenclaw. So you did see your father last night, Harry. You found him inside yourself. In this novel, much is said about Harry's parents, in particular his father. We finally begin to understand the beginning of the Harry Potter series, of how it all started and how it got to where it is now. And Harry's casting of the Patronus charm shows a very deep and profound message within the novels, and it is later re-emphasized in the others. Harry's parents haven't left him, not truly. I spoke before of his father's cloak, but also of his mother's love. Seemingly, his mother's love was Harry's sole protection against evil, but upon reading this book, I realized that I was wrong. Harry's Patronus takes the form of his father's animal. This Patronus, which would continue to protect Harry against the Dementors, against sadness and despair, and fill him with light and happiness, comes from his father. But Harry is so extraordinary that he doesn't only inherit these wonderful things from his father, but he is also son to Lily Potter. Dr. Bruce Charlton puts it best. Harry begins by identifying with his father, for his exploits in Quidditch, his magical skill, and as a dominant gang leader, but ends by recognizing that his father was also a spiteful bully, and that the best in Harry comes from his mother, specifically his mother's exceptionally loving nature, which has both affected Harry and been inherited by him. This is symbolized by the fact that Harry looks almost identical to his father, except that he has his mother's eyes, and therefore, it implied, soul. The people who best understand Harry, Dumbledore, Lupin, and Snape just as he dies, recognize that Harry is his mother's son. But the people who misunderstand Harry, Snape until he dies, and Sirius, see Harry as a reincarnation of his father. And this is absolutely true. Harry has inherited his loving nature from his mother. Why else would he be merciful toward Peter Pettigrew in this novel? And this mercy will help Harry and come back to bite Peter and Voldemort in the very final novel. The exploration of Harry's connection to his father was lost in the movies, where in the book it is the one thing that causes some pang of emotion to the reader. And this idea of love is very rooted to the core of Harry Potter, and it was something that the movies also tried to subvert. There's a scene in the very end where Sirius tells Harry something similar to what Dumbledore told him about how the loved truly never leave us. But instead, he points to Harry's heart, something that was not present in the book, and this was an attempt to undermine some of the more serious themes of Harry Potter, like the recognition of the soul within Harry Potter. Again, in the words of Bruce Charlton, the first and most vital thing is that the Harry Potter series is predicated on the reality of the immortal soul. The reality of the soul is not argued, it is accepted, as indeed it must be. It is there, indispensable and woven through the whole story. Death is real, necessary and irreversible, yet the soul is eternal. And the soul is regarded as being a person's primary concern, susceptible of change as a result of choices. The soul can be maimed and diminished irreversibly by choices during life, as we discover from Harry's sight of Voldemort's maimed and diminished soul in the King's Cross chapter of Deathly Hallows. Such damage cannot be undone after death. But this pointing to the heart was a way of appealing to the very base of the population. Not everyone would be able to understand the message and idea of the soul and how Harry's parents continue to help him and support him throughout the series. But a lot of people can wrap their heads around the idea that those who love them would always be alive in their hearts and minds of the people that remember them. The movies are still motivated by the powerful theme of love, albeit a simplified version, but the many infractions on the movies make them subpar, and all the movies following this one are quite awful. There may be some redeeming qualities of the last few films, but I'll explore those when I get there. These themes only come full circle once we finish the 7th and final novel, such is the genius of this series. I'll end with the words of Bruce Charlton. The deep metaphysical and Christian message of the Harry Potter series is that love has permanent effects. Love affects everything and everybody forever. Love may be overcome by evil, but is never destroyed by it. A special thank you to Brett Stevens and Mark Collett for their support of this channel, and also to the many people who have subscribed, liked, and shared the videos. This brings us to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this video, do consider giving it a like or a dislike if you didn't. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, subscribe for more, and if you would like to support this channel, consider checking out The Guardians of Aria on Amazon, or you can send cash donations through PayPal. See the link in the description for more details. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.